About 40 years ago, Paul Cole and Frank Hurd and Marshall Geddes and Harold Selke and their wives went to Austin for the weekend to play golf. And it rained on Saturday, and the guys couldn't get out on the golf course, so the girls went shopping somewhere, and the guys wound up sitting down together for a meal. And for the first time, though they'd known each other for some 30 years, for the first time began to tell the stories about their experiences in the war. Now, that generation seems remarkably reticent to recount those events. Well, Paul Cole had been a B-24 pilot in Italy and flew the bombing raids over the Ploiești oil fields in Romania. Ploiești, Romania, had the first oil refinery in the world, and it was a critical source of fuel for the entire Nazi machine. Frank Hurd had been in counterintelligence in the United States during the war, and then was sent to Japan after the war, where he served in the Judge Advocate General Corps and was defense counsel in the war crimes after the war. In fact, Frank Hurd was the defense attorney in the second war crimes trial in Japan after the war, defending a Japanese camp commandant who was on trial for choosing to randomly kill an American prisoner whose last name was Hurd. Marshall and Harold had both been in the Pacific on different ships during the course of the war, and they discovered they had both been in Okinawa on the same day and had witnessed the same kamikaze attack, but had never known that until that brunch there in Austin. It's an amazing thing to consider the service that our men and women have rendered when we've asked them to go into harm's way. And since that second great war to end all wars, we've sent our sons and daughters to Korea, to Vietnam, twice to Iraq, to Afghanistan, and to countless other smaller incursions around the world. And I just thought on this Veterans Day, you should hear us together say, thank you. And we're grateful. So can I say for all of us, to all of you who have served when asked, thank you. What I want to talk about today is the critical importance in our own lives of gratitude. The critical importance that gratitude takes and makes as we walk through our days. I think for most people, faith is really just going through the motions of religion until we come to a place where we recognize our own helplessness. Until we come to the place where we recognize our helplessness. Something happens in our lives and we come to a place where we see, I cannot do what needs to be done. I don't have the power, I don't have the resource, I don't have the ability to affect the change that I want to see made in front of me. I can't heal the one that I love. I can't fix the mess that I've made. I can't atone for my own sin. When we come to the point of helplessness, we have to say, if there is to be anything else, it's up to God. And when we come to that point, it takes us to one of two places. Either we become angry because we worship a God who doesn't love us or who doesn't have power to help us or who's capricious or arbitrary. And what happens is inside we become embittered, and outside we lash out in rage in inappropriate ways because we have anger that we haven't dealt with. Or we come to the place in which we say, if there's to be anything else, it's up to God. And that grows within us an incredible gratitude because we have a God who is able to deliver us. Because we have a God who loves us and who makes real difference in the world and in our own lives. When we receive grace from God, what happens when we really recognize what that is gratitude wells up inside of us. Internally, we experience that as joy. Externally, that is manifested as generosity. For most people, I think the journey to deep faith begins when we discover our own helplessness. And the journey to healthy faith is the one that moves from grace to gratitude to joy to generosity. Because grace meets us where we are. It comes because we need it, not because we deserve it, not because we've earned it. Gratitude is the healthy response to grace, and when gratitude wells up inside of us, joy takes root in us and generosity pours out of us, and that journey has the absolute power to change your life and my life for the better and forever, even today. I am increasingly convinced that the point of this life is for us to have enough experiences where we have to trust God, that we discover God's faithfulness so that when we come to the end of our days here on this earth, and when each of us meets that moment in which there is no choice but to say, if there's to be anything else, it's up to God. That we can know beyond knowing that that is affirmatively good news. I want to introduce you this morning to a character who I think began to make that journey, and we see the moment when it takes root in his life. You'll find his story chronicled for us in the 19th chapter of Luke's Gospel, beginning in the first verse. If you have a copy of the Scripture, would you open it with me there? Luke chapter 19, beginning in verse 1. Luke chapter 19 and verse 1, and there the Scripture says, Jesus entered and was passing through Jericho. And there was a man there whose name was Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector, and he was wealthy. Zacchaeus sought to see Jesus, but because he was a wee little man, he could not because of the crowd. So he ran on ahead and he climbed up into a sycamore tree because Jesus was passing that way. And when Jesus reached that place, he stopped and looked up and he said, Zacchaeus, come down from there immediately, for I must stay in your house today. And immediately Zacchaeus came down from the tree and received him gladly. All the people saw this, and they began to mutter, he is going to be the guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus said, see, Lord, here and now, I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I have robbed anyone of anything, I will pay them back 4 times over. And Jesus said to him, salvation has come to this house today. For this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save that which was lost. This is the word of the Lord. Do you remember Zacchaeus? Did you learn about Zacchaeus in children's Sunday school? That's where I learned about Zacchaeus. We love Zacchaeus in Sunday school because you can act out the story and somebody can climb up in the tree. And did you learn the song? Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord Jesus to see. Zacchaeus, Zacchaeus, so we... It's not a really great song, but it's really kind of a fun song to sing. I'm just saying. It's a vivid story that captures our imaginations. And children love Zacchaeus because often they get stuck at the back of the crowd and they can't see. And so the idea that somebody found a way to fix that's exciting to them. And sometimes adults like Zacchaeus because we want to get closer to Jesus, but we're worried that the path to doing that's going to be embarrassing in some way or it's going to cost us something. But Zacchaeus was brave where we're fearful. Zacchaeus means pure one or righteous one. But he was neither, and he knew it. He was a chief tax collector. That term appears only here in Luke 19 in all of Greek literature. Archeteleones. Arche means ruler among the tax collectors. So it ties him back to the rich young ruler in chapter 18 if you ever want to play compare and contrast between those two. But the point of it is that he is someone who made money downward as well as sideways. He made money sideways. He was a tax collector, which meant he worked for the Roman government, securing their taxes from his own people. Back in the first century, you didn't fill out a form and get it in the mail on April 15th or October 15th like some of y'all do. What you did is the tax collector showed up at your house and told you, this is how much you owe. Now, you don't know how much Rome had written down because the tax collector has added some amount to that, and they're going to keep the excess, and that's how they get paid. And if you don't like it, they've got a squad of Roman soldiers behind them, so you can lump it. Zacchaeus made money by skimming off on the side, but he also made money from beneath. He was a chief tax collector. He had tax collectors who worked for him, and so he would require that in addition to the money they kept for themselves, they also skim some money and pay to him. It's a little organized crime syndicate he's got working here. Zacchaeus was a guy who robbed from the poor to give to, well, just to give to himself. If you think Bernie Madoff, you will not be far off from the assessment that Jericho has of Zacchaeus. Can you imagine what it was like living around Zacchaeus? As his house grew larger and more lavish, as he acquired more and more slaves to do his bidding, as his clothes grew finer and more numerous, everyone in town knew it was their money funding his lifestyle, and he had no right to it. And everyone in town knew there was not a thing in the world they could do about it. Except every time they saw him, they called out, "Zacchaeus, pure one, righteous one," and the irony dripped off their lips. He was neither, and he knew it. And there's something terrible about having a name that you can't live up to. He climbed up in a sycamore tree, and Jesus came under and looked up to him. That's the first time in a long time anybody's looked up to Zacchaeus in any way, shape, or form. But somehow Jesus saw through the graft and the greed. Somehow Jesus saw through the corruption and the callousness with which Zacchaeus treated his fellow citizens. Jesus had enough time around tax collectors. Maybe it was his friendship with Matthew that let him see. Jesus knew what a tax collector's life was like. He knew that there was something in them that could not overcome the temptation to take more than what belonged to them. And he knew they had a sickness for which he had the only medicine. So he said, "Come down immediately, for I must stay in your house today." And so Jesus invited himself into Zacchaeus' home, and that's a little awkward. I would have loved for Luke to be able to tell us how that conversation went. How do you imagine it going? Who's doing most of the talking there? Is it Zacchaeus or is it Jesus? Does Jesus go in and say, "Zacchaeus, I want to tell you the plan God had for your life that you're not living into so you can know what a disappointment you really are"? Or does he just listen to him? When you're in the presence of God, does he ask about you? Tell me about your life. How did you become so wealthy? Who are your friends? How do you get along with your wife? Tell me about your children. We don't have a manuscript of that conversation. And I tend to think when you're in the presence of pure love, you are the subject of the conversation. I wonder what it was in that conversation that awakened in Zacchaeus the space that grace makes to think, to ponder, to consider, to really hear and see what's happening and to change. I wonder what it was about that conversation that helped Zacchaeus realize for the first time it wasn't so much that he had stuff, it was that so much stuff had him. And if this was one of those conversations in which Jesus finally said to him, "Well, Zacchaeus, what will it profit you to gain the whole world if you lose your soul?" Something happened in that exchange. And something came alive for the first time in Zacchaeus. At the beginning of the story, it says he sought to see Jesus. He was seeing to see Jesus. That's why he climbed up in the tree. And Jesus saw him, and he came down, and they went to his house. And did you catch it then? See, Lord? Let me let you see now. Here and now, I give half of my possessions to the poor. Here and now, if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I'll pay them back 4 times over. Something has happened inside of Zacchaeus. There's a new life in him. Outside of him, it is generosity that is just pouring itself out. These treasures that he has hoarded and put together at the cost of everyone else in town, he just gives them away. He just gives them away. Freely, painlessly, joyfully. And then he says, if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I'll pay them back 4 times over. That's a big deal. Because the Old Testament spells out what you're supposed to do if you discover you have defrauded someone and you want to, of your own volition, fix the mess you've made. Both Leviticus and Numbers say, if you have cheated someone and you want to make that right, and you're doing it of your own free will, you pay them back the principal plus 20% interest. Principal plus 20%, and you are good to go. The law has made you clean. If the town comes to you and the people around you say, you have cheated someone and you have to make this right, if you're being compelled to make something right when you've cheated somebody, twice. The principal plus an equal amount, and you are clean. Zacchaeus said, 4 times over will I repay anyone to whom I have done any wrong. There is a generosity that is pouring out of Zacchaeus. And if you listen for it, you hear there's a great joy on the inside. This one who was the wee little man grew to have the greatest and largest heart that Jesus ever encountered in Israel. My friend Ralph West, who's the pastor of the Church Without Walls here in Houston, describes what happens when we discover God's grace and we become people who are grateful and we begin to experience His joy. Ralph described that better than anyone else I've ever heard. He said, there are things the Lord will give you that you can't buy over the counter. There are a lot of folks who have a lot of stuff, but they can't sleep at night. And when they eat, they can't hold it on their stomach, and they wish they could walk around the room. Ralph said, God has given me something they don't have. Joy. You can't buy that. You can buy happiness for a minute. You can buy entertainment for a season. But you can't buy joy. Joy is when everything around you is collapsing and you are not pulling your hair out. You still hold it there and God is still keeping you, and you should have given up a long time ago, but there is a reservoir of power within you because of God's joy. Peace. You can't buy that. I know a lot of people who buy sedatives. We take prescription medications to take the edge off. Or we take drugs or alcohol to bring the numb on, but they don't address the root of the problem. But there have been times in my life when people are going crazy all around me, and I can just fold my hands. Because the Lord said to me, I neither slumber nor sleep. And if the Lord's going to stay up all night watching over me, there's no sense in me losing sleep in that transaction. I'll just rest and be at peace. Joy, peace, hope. Do you know what hope is? Hope is praying, expecting, trusting, holding on. And I don't know what it is for which you are praying, but pray and hold on and expect and trust, and then open up your arms and trust that God will fill your arms with His presence. Because I know what the Lord can do. And there are people sitting around you in this very room today who, if they told their stories, would tell you, it hasn't always been like it is today. But I prayed, and I waited, and I trusted, and the Lord made a way for me when no way was available before. Can you tell that story? That's why we sing that hymn. All I have needed, thy hand has provided. Great is thy faithfulness, Lord, unto me. Do you see what happened to Zacchaeus? He didn't deserve it. He needed it. And Jesus gave him grace. And somewhere in that transaction, it began to well up inside of him like gratitude. It took root in him as joy, and it poured out of him as generosity. And Jesus said, that is salvation. Salvation has come to this house today. That is salvation. This is what God meant when He said to Abram, I want to bless you. And I'm going to bless the whole world through you. And now you are a son of Abraham too. Whose child are you? Which God do you worship? When you get to the point of helplessness, does it take you to anger and bitterness and rage, or to gratitude and joy and generosity? Whose child are you? Salvation can be yours. Salvation can be yours. And you can be a blessing if you worship the right God, if you receive His grace. If gratitude grows in you to become joy and pours out of you as generosity, that's how you know. Well, would you pray with me? Gracious God, bring us to the place of our helplessness, so that in that place we can know who it is we really worship. Bring us to our place of helplessness, so that we can truly receive your grace, and that we know beyond knowing if there is anything else, it is up to you. And because it's up to you, gratitude wells up in us, gives us joy, makes us generous, so that we are your children and a part of your blessing of the whole world. For this is our prayer. In the name of your Son, who came to seek and to save what was lost. And all God's people said,